Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome. Hello, CDL. All right. My name is Sonia Senek. I'm the Executive Director of Creative Destruction Lab. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to our first in-person super session since 2019. So, we get the great pleasure to welcome our 12 CDL sites globally to event today. Before we start, I wish to acknowledge the land we're meeting on. This is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Encourage everyone to take a moment to the land we are on, its history, and the people who've come before us. Now, I know I introduced myself at the very start, but for some of you, you may only recognize me on Zoom, so I thought this would help. So it's good to see you again. I see, yeah, he recognized me. See you again. So today and tomorrow, we will find ourselves on the thin edge of the wedge of the future of innovation. Our morning content is packed with big, bold ideas. Everything from the impact of artificial intelligence on society, geopolitical shifts in innovation, and the advancement of human-like intelligence. As many of you may know, CDL supports companies in the very early stages of the innovator's journey. Many of our founders are tackling massive problems by using their creativity, imagination, and technical skills to create something that's never existed before. But what happens when things don't go to plan? When a founder stands in front of a mountain that they're not sure that they can climb? I'm going to ask you now to take a look at your left, take a look at your right. This is the community of mentors who've supported founders in taking one step at a time up their mountain, or 3 steps every 8 weeks. Our CDL, that's a little CDL joke. Okay. Our CDL mentors contribute so much more than what you see in our CDL session rooms. From taking calls on a weekend to guide a founder through a first term sheet, or to support them through personal circumstances that's dramatically changing the trajectory of their business and their life, the generosity of this community of mentors is truly special. So on behalf of every CDL site, all the founders from this year and years past, to each and every one of our mentors, we cannot thank you enough for volunteering to invest your time, energy, and wisdom to our incredible founders. Can I have a round of applause for our CDL mentors? Now, in 2022, this program year, CDL admitted over 675 applicants from a pool of over 3,000, 675 ventures from a pool of over 3,000 applicants. 250 of these ventures graduated this year, and you will be meeting them between today and tomorrow during our events. I'm just going to zoom in on 3 of our graduates from this year's cohort to give you a sense of the types of innovations we're seeing at CDL. Over the next 2 days, you'll have the opportunity to meet ventures like Iden Technologies, based in Switzerland. They participated in CDL Neuro at the CDL Toronto site. They're developing earbuds with built-in EE sensors that can measure and process brain signals at a fraction of the cost, the same fidelity as industry standard. Or Cal Morris from Michigan. Go Wolverines. Anyone? No? Yeah? Yes? One person. Who participated in CDL Space, delivered by our CDL Atlanta, CDL Toronto, and CDL Paris sites. They're developing technologies to solve the looming space debris problem, or space junk, by repurposing uncooperative objects in orbit. Or, for example, Bioeffect Innovations from our CDL Ag stream at CDL Rockies in Calgary. Bioeffect is using synthetic biology to make custom protein ingredients for the food and beverage industry. This includes a no-calorie protein sweetener that's 2,000 times sweeter than sugar. Right? Somebody needs to tell Tim Hortons about this. Okay, Tim Hortons, by the way, for anyone who's traveling internationally, is a donut shop and a coffee shop in Canada. You'll see many of them. And so much more. We are a not-for-profit organization here at CDL, so any bit of value being created by CDL is being brought to life by our visionary founding partners, corporate partners, and government partners. Throughout CDL Super Session, you're going to see a set of logos on the screens around the space here. But behind these logos are individuals, amazing innovators in our corporate community who have committed themselves to helping CDL come to life. So I'd like to kickstart a massive round of applause to thank our MVPs, our CDL partners. And now we are going to talk about the structure of Super Session. We have intentionally placed content at the beginning of the day. Prepare to be stimulated. We have a great deal of time for lunch and networking, so you have time to absorb and engage with your peers. And we hope that you have discussions that expand your mind, spark ideas, innovations, and potentially even new ventures that will make their way through CDL in the future. So how can you make the most of your time at Super Session? We welcome you to lean in. Let's get to know each other in person and not behind screens. We hope you build relationships and continue to build something massive together. CDL is a network of networks, and CDL Super Session is a platform for inspiring more connection and creativity in the future. We hope that you leave feeling inspired by what you believe the future holds. Now, before I sign off, a few operational items, like any good CDL session. Slack. Just like all CDL sessions, this is a double-threaded conversation, so there's going to be content on stage. We want you to engage in the one general or two main stage channels. If you have Slack on your phone, you get the great benefit of using the QR codes. So every venture founder you meet has a QR code on their lanyard. You can simply scan the QR code, and it'll take you straight to a poll that gives you information about the venture and a selection of one of three options. You're interested in helping this founder with connections, interested in learning about their future investment rounds, interested in chatting about anything. You can connect with the ventures directly through those polls. So please do log on to Slack if you haven't already, and maybe even on your phone. Next is CDL Bingo. Yes, we are trying to have fun at this event, okay? So CDL Bingo, there are prizes. You can go around. If you picked up a card on your registration, one of the stamps is, of course, winning an arm wrestle against me. Good luck to everybody. For all of our CDL sessions throughout the year, we have logged in. All of our venture-facing documents are here, your schedule, information about any of the folks that you're meeting. This year we had over 40,000 logins and over 100,000 over the last 2 years. I want to take a second to say a huge thank you to our CDL tech team, our network ops team, and all of our CDL site team members who have worked to make the CDL portal come to life this year. So please do log onto the portal. Of course, if something goes wrong, there is help desk by registration. And lastly, social media. We have so much incredible content for you in these next 2 days, and we'd love for you to share it. This is unlike our typical CDL sessions. So please do tag CDL Super Session 2023 and tag us on Twitter @CreativeDLab. And with that, I am pleased to introduce Professor Ajay Agarwal, founder of Creative Destruction Lab, the Jeffrey Tabor Chair in Entrepreneurship and Innovation, and Professor of Strategic Management at the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto. Please join me in welcoming Ajay.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Sonia. I don't want to embarrass him, but somewhere in this audience is Sonia was just talking about the Slack channel. Somewhere in the audience is my 12-year-old son who signed up and within about 3 minutes was banned from the channel for whatever he posted. I want him to stand up. I'm not even sure where he is, but he learned his lesson. He wrote an apology to Sonia, and it was all good. So welcome to Toronto for everyone who's flown in from overseas. We're so happy to have you here. From CDL Seattle to CDL Wisconsin, CDL Atlanta, CDL Oxford, CDL Paris, CDL Berlin, CDL Estonia, CDL Vancouver, CDL Rockies, CDL Montreal, CDL Toronto, CDL Atlantic. On behalf of everyone, welcome. We're so thrilled that you're here. We are convening here at a time when there is so much going on in the world. There are many topics. I would argue that 2 of these topics have bubbled to the top and may be the most salient in parts of the world. One of those is artificial intelligence, and the other is geopolitics. Over the next 2 days, we are going to dig into both of those. And on the geopolitics side, it's not just Russia, Ukraine, it's all the chess pieces on the board and how they are interrelated. This morning, in this morning's sessions, we are starting with artificial intelligence. Mostly by happenstance, CDL was formed in the crucible. We launched CDL in 2012. And the same year, some graduate students from University of Toronto flew to Stanford for Lee's ImageNet competition and stunned the computer vision world with the performance of a new technique that they called deep. Back at on the U of T campus that year, we were running our first cohort. And we had a student show up at our front door. His name was Abe Heifetz. He was a graduate student of Professor Jeff Hinton. And he came to us and said, I've got a new technique that I'm using to predict which molecules will most effectively bind with which proteins to advance the way that we do drug discovery. A rapid increase in efficiency in how we do drug discovery. Increases speed, lowers the cost. After we dug into this a bit, we realized, wait a minute, this technique actually has extremely broad applicability, all kinds of predictions using multimodal data. And furthermore, just by coincidence, we have at the University of Toronto campus a greater concentration of graduate students trained in this technique than at any other institution in the world. Shortly after that, in 2015, we decided to launch our first specialized stream in artificial intelligence. In fact, I'm thrilled that my co-founder of that stream is here with us today from Austin, Texas, Siobhan Zillis. Launched this stream focused in AI. Up till that point, CDL had been very broad, that innovations from all parts of the biology and so on, the medical school, engineering, computer science were coming into CDL, but we would start a stream focused on this narrow domain. And Siobhan, you'll remember that there were a number of detractors who said, oh, this is going to lower the quality bar because you can't possibly fill a stream of 25 companies all using this one technique. Then a couple of years later, that stream took off so fast that under the leadership of Madame Hélène Desmarais at HEC Montréal, we launched another AI stream at CDL Montreal. And then shortly after that, under the leadership at Oxford University, we launched another AI stream at CDL Oxford. And today, this past year, as Sonia described, CDL has grown 650 startups from the global network around the world, and over half of them used some instantiation of machine intelligence as the core of what they were doing across streams: energy stream, ocean stream, agriculture stream, material science stream, all the health streams, everybody using some form of this computational statistics. Reinforcement learning. Tomorrow you're going to be very lucky to hear from the pioneer of the reinforcement learning field, Professor Rich Sun from the University of Alberta. Welcome and thank you for joining us. We'll be speaking tomorrow. Then we realized, two of my colleagues, Professor Joshua Gans, who's right here, and Professor Avi Goldfarb, who's here, because we had a front row seat. To see all this commercialization of AI that was happening in all these different domains. And we felt it like a moral obligation that, okay, we need to take these things that we're getting to see. We have the privilege of seeing all these different types of applications and pull out the common threads and communicate them to the rest of the world. And we wrote a first book in 2018, Prediction Machines, and the second book in 2022, both on Harvard Press, Power and Prediction. And so I think it's fair to say that Creative Destruction Lab has been not just a participant in the AI revolution, but we've been an advocate, a catalyst, a leader. You may want to hold your applause until you hear what I'm about to say and what Daron's about to say. We have been arguably a leader in the AI revolution in terms of the commercialization of AI. And let me remind you that our mission statement, the mission at CDL, is to enhance the commercialization of science for the betterment of humankind. Our mission is to enhance the commercialization of science for the betterment of humankind. So then you might be shocked that for the first time after COVID, when we reconvene everybody at our grand finale event of the year, that we would choose to open our session with a focus on a book whose primary thesis is that there may be no greater threat to our future prosperity and our democracy, artificial intelligence. The authors of this book write, what if AI fundamentally disrupts the labor market where most of us earn our livelihoods, expanding inequalities of pay and work? What if its main impact will not be to increase productivity, but to redistribute power and prosperity away from ordinary people towards those controlling data and making key corporate decisions? What if along this path AI also impoverishes billions in the developing world? What if it reinforces existing biases, for example, based on skin color? What if it destroys democratic institutions? The evidence is mounting that all these concerns are valid. AI appears set on a trajectory that will multiply inequalities, not just in industrialized countries, but everywhere around the world. Fueled by massive data collection by tech companies and authoritarian governments, it is stifling democracy, strengthening autocracy. No, we would dismiss this kind of text as hyperbole, mongering by sensationalists motivated to sell books. Except the authors of this book aren't sensationalists. In fact, they are perhaps two of the most revered economists in our profession. Both of them teach and conduct research at the premier technology research institute in the world, MIT. Doron Acemoglu, one of the authors, is one of the most prolific and influential economists in our discipline. In fact, rather than recite to you all of his awards and accomplishments and accolades, it's actually more efficient for me to tell you about the awards he hasn't yet won. And in terms of major awards, there's basically one, the Nobel Prize. As far as my colleagues and I can tell, he's pretty much won every other major award in our field. And many in our discipline think that the final pin will fall soon. So I should probably pause here and welcome Doron and thank him for flying in from Boston to join us. And to be fair to Professor Acemoglu and his co-author, Simon Johnson, they don't characterize AI as inevitably bad. What they do say is that the path that we're currently on will lead to bad outcomes for many people. However, drawing on lessons from history, they argue that there is a new path, a change in direction, that will lead civilization to a good outcome. The ideas in this book are not company level or even country level. They are civilization level ideas. And so we take them seriously, even though they strike at the very heart of what CDL does, the commercialization of science to benefit humankind. In fact, it's precisely because the ideas in his book strike at the heart of what we do that we decided it was our moral obligation to launch our super session this year with a discussion of the important topics raised in Doron's book. However, we don't take these ideas lying down. We don't take them for granted. Ideas that are so important deserve scrutiny, they deserve discussion, and they deserve debate. So buckle up. We are going to tackle Doron's book head on, chapter by chapter. This place looks like it's up for a rock concert, but it's full of nerds, and we're going to spend 2 hours on a book. Okay? So, here's how we're doing it. We asked 11 members of our CDL community. Each one of them has dedicated a significant fraction of their professional careers advancing technology, commercializing science. We've asked each one, they've got 4 minutes, we've asked them to spend their first 2 minutes to summarize the key point of the chapter that they were assigned. 11 chapters, 11 speakers. 2 minutes. They're going to summarize the key point of the chapter, And then in their second 2 minutes, we asked them to highlight what's the single point that you found most surprising, most objectionable. And so we're going to hear chapter, 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 then a response from the author. Chapter, 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 response from the author. That's how we're going to proceed. So, with that, we're going to begin with chapter 1, fly across the country to Atlantic Canada, and welcome Rhiannon. Over to you.
Thank you, Ajay. And welcome. Thank you for the book. I did enjoy it, and I feel quite honored to be given the task of talking about chapter 1 because it is an extremely robust chapter. So chapter 1 opens up with talking about the fact that the application of advancement of knowledge has really transformed human existence. It's been beneficial. There have been productivity increases. It's improved lives, living standards, and it's led to this really great optimism that technology can save and solve a lot of problems. But since 1980s, productivity has actually decreased. Real wages have stagnated, and we're moving towards a truly two-tiered society where inequality is increasing and fewer people are reaping the rewards of technology. The book goes on to talk about the fact that new tech doesn't automatically bring widespread prosperity. When tech focuses just on automation, surveillance, control, it actually weakens the power of labor, making greater average productivity, but not marginal productivity per person. Marginal productivity needs new tasks and new things in order to be successful and to grow. Revenue per worker then increases, wages increase, and labor is seen as a resource and meant to increase output and not just a cost reduction. So in order to achieve shared prosperity, everybody needs to be consulted. More people need to be evaluating technology, and the implications for everybody's lives need to be taken into account, not just the business owners. We also need to be making the right social, political, and economic choices to redirect technology and create what the book calls a countervailing power to the elite, self-interested, and narrow vision of the business owners at the moment. And so what does that mean for us today? Ajay has talked about the incredible speed that technology is moving, and the book talks about artificial intelligence, this incredible exponential drive at the moment of change. And there's this great notion that many of us share that technology is going to save us from the problems that we're facing. But the vision of technology is driven at the moment by a very, very small group of people. Men, all men. And these people have similar backgrounds, perspectives, and interests, and the book calls them the vision oligarchy. People with similar interests who control the vision, the data, the tools, and are amassing an immense power in driving and rolling this out. And the conclusion of the book is actually of this chapter in any case, is quite positive around that. It does acknowledge that we have amazing tools, technology can make massive changes and can improve lives, but only if we make the right choices, only if we make the right decisions and become more inclusive in our choices and not just focus those choices on a few elite tech leaders. A suggestion that we look at history, and the rest of the book looks at the history of technology advancement in the development, and a reality that we need to act now. And I found a number of things very controversial in this first chapter, but also some things that were very, very exciting. The most objectionable was the lack of focus on gender, and I won't dive into that much more because I understand that some of my other colleagues are going to be addressing this topic as well. But another area that I found objectionable, and it lies on Ajay, your mention of geopolitical concerns and developments, is 20 seconds? Yep. it's in one word. It's critical that we rein in this oligarchy, and not just because we're on a precipice. By reining in the oligarchy and using those terms, I fear that we're going to slow ourselves down. And we cannot afford to slow ourselves down as we drive for this all-important inclusion that I support absolutely, but we cannot be reined in and slow down technology in parallel.
Rhiannon, thank you very
Thank you.
much. And Franz, the clock is right here. 4 minutes from CDL Montreal.
All right. Jeez. So my chapter discussed the failed attempt of Ferdinand Lesseps to build a canal in Panama in the late 19th century. Lesseps was inspired by his success of the Suez Canal. He envisioned a sea-level canal in Panama. However, he faced numerous challenges, including terrain, disease, and inadequate funding. Lesseps underestimated the amount of excavation required and the risks that disease like malaria or yellow fever would pose. Despite warning from experts, he plowed on. He remained optimistic, denied the existence of problems. The project faced financial difficulties. He struggled to raise enough capital. And by the late 1880s, he tried to tap into the bond market multiple times, was struggling to raise additional capital. He even considered issuing lottery bonds, but faced opposition from the Legislative Assembly. The death toll among workers reached a staggering number of estimated 22,000 deaths, including 5,000 French workers. Eventually, the project was abandoned, and Lesseps died in disgrace. His son and associates went to prison, and the project was then abandoned, and leaving a trail of substantial loss of life and, obviously, money. Then the Americans take over. In the project, in 1904, they started a new chapter in construction of the Panama Canal, and they employed better engineering techniques and adopted measures to approach the disease, and they implemented a lock system to overcome the challenges posed by the terrain, and successfully completed the canal by 1914. This American-led construction of the canal highlighted the importance of proper planning, expertise, attention to detail. Overall, the story of the Panama Canal construction reveals the failures of Lesseps' ambitious and flawed approach and the ultimate success achieved by the Americans through meticulous planning and effective execution. The Panama Canal stands as a statement to human ingenuity and engineering prowess, but its construction came at a supremely high cost in terms of human life and financial resources. So the story, there are multiple stories, because there was also in the beginning of the chapter Napoleon's story as well. But these stories, they illustrate the power of compelling vision to push through technological frontiers, but also highlighted the consequences of disregarding practical challenges and the well-being of those affected. Lesseps' vision was rooted in ideas that were pushed by Henri de Saint-Simon, who believed in progress driven by scientific invention, industry, and the leadership of men of genius. You know this, men of genius. The pursuit of large infrastructure projects like the canal is means to unite the world and promote prosperity. However,
30 seconds.
These visions fail to consider the complexity on local indigenous. So, two things. First is, of all the people that died, they came from the West Indians. They would have had to be either black or indigenous. So that's one could have been talked upon. And the second part of it is, throughout history, there's a number of these mega projects that have contributed to advancing society, but always at the cost of lives.
Franz, thank you very much. Now going to Chapter 3 in New York City, a guest and friend of Creative Destruction Lab from Union Square Ventures, Albert Wenger.
Chapter 3 is called The Power to Persuade. It grapples with the question, why is it that some ideas rise to prominence while others get ignored? It makes an important point, which is that in modern society, we tend to rely on persuasion more than on coercion. And that outright coercion often results in, but persuasion is a much more subtle means of exercising power. It emphasizes how we tend to give more credence to the opinion of people who are already of high status, who already hold power, thus causing kind of a self-reinforcing loop of certain ideas becoming ever more powerful. The chapter gives a bunch of interesting examples, starting again with Lesseps and with Napoleon, but slightly more extended examples on how in the American South the kind of reconstruction project was turned down and the Jim Crow laws were instituted. And Dunning, who was an academic at Columbia, played an important role in providing sort of moral support to this project. And the US Supreme Court as an institution also deeply embedded it. There's also another example of what happened with the global financial crisis, how we essentially let the bankers talk us all into bailing them and their shareholders out, resulting in even larger banks and richer bankers afterwards. So these are two good examples. There's also an idea that we're all familiar with the saying that power corrupts. The chapter extends this to people become more powerful, they find it easier to persuade, and they find it easier to often pursue their own goals or goals that benefit themselves, often to help others. Now, I have two chapters. One is a minor one, which is the chapter makes no mention of the role of media, either mass media or social media in this, which feels like a big omission given that we're living in this strange transition from the power of mainstream media to mass media. But my bigger question to the author is as an MIT alum, the authors are, as AJ pointed out, at the top of their profession, highly regarded. They're a highly regarded institution, which allows them to write a book that'll be published by a prestigious publishing house, which gets discussed at a prestigious conference. So they themselves hold much of this power to set the dialogue. And while as a trained economist, I'm excited to see economists say, oh, this doesn't just take care of itself magically, referring everybody to the lump of labor fallacy as economists are prone to do, which is not happening here. At the same time, though, this chapter explicitly says that we need more democracy to avoid the tyranny of narrow visions, and it says that we can be caught in a vision trap. Once a vision becomes dominant, its shackles are difficult to throw off. But it seems trapped in one of the core visions of economics, which is that everybody has to work, that the goal of society is to find employment for people, and leveraging this technology in ways to create more employment. That's a very narrow vision relative to what this technology might enable. And this is particularly relevant because later in the book, other ideas such as universal basic income get dismissed on 2 pages, in part using arguments that have since been debunked by many of the trials that are going on all around the world. So this book in and of itself is very much an agenda-setting book. It's a book that will dominate the dialogue on technology, and I believe with a rather narrow vision.
Okay, Albert, thank you very much. So just so that everybody gets a sense, we invite one prestigious professor from MIT. He's introduced by the award he hasn't yet won, and then he has 3 people critique the book before he gets to say anything. So Professor Acemoglu, thank you for being such a good sport, and over to you.
Thank you, AJ. So I feel like I'm in the hot chair, so at least I'll stand up here. So first of all, this is a true pleasure to be here, even though I might regret it, and it might look a little bit cruel, 11 amazing minds criticizing the book. It is a privilege because Simon and I wrote the book because we want to advance the conversation. and perhaps we should have said this a little bit more explicitly in the book. I've said it in some podcasts and interviews. We don't think we have the answers. We don't pretend we have the answers. We think that this is a really transformative period, and there are a lot more questions that should be center stage. And we wrote the book in order to encourage more people to think about these questions. So if there is one axiom in the book that we take almost for granted, and I'll defend it if necessary, it is that democratic control of technology is desirable. And what I mean by that is that technologies that are going to be completely transformative for society, and AI, whatever you think of its promise in terms of, general intelligence or healthcare or whatever, it is clear it's going to be ubiquitous. It's going to have effects on every domain of life, every sector of the economy. So for technologies like this, having broader set of inputs is critical, but of course that needs to be educated, thoughtful input. And I think the role of many people who are at the forefront of the technology and of the social consequences of this technology is to encourage more of this conversation. So it is in that spirit that the book was written. And it may well be that our vision is narrow, but our hope is that this is not the vision that people will take, but that it will be an input into that conversation. And why is this the right time, and why are these issues so important? The way that I think is, however promising and transformative a technology such as AI or generative AI or digital technologies more broadly may be, the direction in which they are developed is of even greater importance. And this statement might at first strike some of you as controversial, because we are used to thinking that there is a frontier of science or a frontier of technology either pushed by genius entrepreneurs or that sort of almost naturally follows from past progress. There's some degree of truth to that, but there is even more choice about where to take the technology, how to apply it, in what ways to develop it, and this choice has tremendous social implications. And it is in this spirit that we make the book so historical, because we want to dismiss the conceit that somehow past technological breakthroughs seamlessly, automatically brought all good outcomes. So we go through several examples in the book, some of them you may still hear about, where past major innovations, some of them as sweeping for their time as AI perhaps, generated a lot of losers. Sometimes the losses may have been even bigger than the gains despite the promise of technology. And in several examples where things have worked out, that wasn't automatic. There was a process of social change, redirection of technology, some sort of involvement from a broader set of voices that was important. So that's the spirit in which the whole thing is written. And in that, we had to make some choices to prevent the book from becoming even longer than it already is, which I think is at the limit of the carrying capacity of most humans. So yes, absolutely, there's absolutely much more to be said on gender. Actually, the way that gender interacts with automation is super interesting. Social media and gender, some of this I have done work, but we decided not to sort of work on that. But there are other topics that we've omitted that could be as important. But we also had to take some positions. And Albert has rightly called out on one very important building block, which is discussed much more later in the book, but it already sort of is apparent in chapter 1, that we take it as a very important part of what we want from technology, that it should empower humans in the production process as well as in other domains. In particular, technology is empowering humans in controlling their information and how to use that information, how to process that information. That's where social media and democracy discussion comes in, but also about whether it's empowering them to be more productive in the production process. Why is that? For two reasons. One, however excited I am about the developments concerning AI, I do not believe that in any foreseeable future, let's say 80 years, we are going to see AI replace most tasks that humans do. So if we want AI to be productive and to have good social outcomes, it is essential that we turn it into a tool for humans. So it is a very cold-hearted macroeconomic calculation. We're not going to get the productivity benefits from AI just with automation. You really need to make humans more productive as well. And the second, which we discuss much more, not enough, but more in the context of the UBI, we think that promising AI will produce and humans can take leisure, I think that is a defeatist vision, because it will go more towards a two-tier society, and moreover, there are many philosophical issues about how a society would work when people are not really feeling that they are contributing to social good and they are seen by their peers as contributing to social good. So I hope we can come back to those issues. I hope we weren't too summary in rejecting UBI, but I'll stand by that.
All right. Okay, Daron, thank you. Now we'll go the other direction across the country to CDL Rockies. Ellison, over to you. Chapter 4.
I was absolutely thrilled when Ajay asked me to speak today until I got the book. And I'm saying that kind of glibly, but essentially, Darren, this was a disturbing view of agricultural technologies over the centuries. I was left just up and thinking constantly about it. Using technology, essentially the sum thought was using technology that increased agricultural productivity benefited only a privileged few, but deepened the poverty of many. And I found that I struggled with that. The author demonstrated that this was a common thread across medieval England, the US South, and the Soviet Union. During the Middle Ages, religious belief, repression, and coercion kept peasants at the borders of starvation. From the middle of the 16th century onward, men with property did well, those without did not. Whitney's cotton gin expanded cotton plantations, but the lives of the slaves that did the work were brutal. Soviet total farm output at the end of the 1930s would have been almost 46% higher without communist collectives. Over the centuries, how agricultural technologies were used by men in power had the greatest effect on whether prosperity was shared across society. Now, I got a bit of ribbing because I thought I'm going to throw in some slides. You give me 3 slides, I'll take 3 slides. But measured as total factor productivity, agricultural productivity increases when outputs rise, with inputs remaining constant or decreasing. This slide represents the benefit of technology to agriculture. Total factor productivity is just a big wide band. Since 1961, and the book kind of stopped in 1920s on ag tech. In 1961, we have done an impressive job increasing agricultural productivity. Outputs increased 4-fold, use of inputs doubled. This productivity growth has created greater prosperity shared by many, but not without massive environmental impact, which was actually not mentioned in the book. Agricultural uses 30% of the world's energy, accounts for 24% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and 71% of fresh water use. Over 30% of our soils are degraded. We need technology. Now, to join with Rhiannon, women were mostly invisible in this chapter, though we were told in the fields They ran the dairies and they manufactured textiles. But here's where I draw some very uneasy parallels in this book. Today, globally, women have equal economic and legal rights in only 14 countries. We have 195 countries in the world. That's not a good batting record. Agriculture is the single largest employer in the world, employing 60% in the developing world, where women make up 43% of our farmers. But today, these farmers remain as invisible as the women in the book and the women from history. Smallholder farms produce up to 80% of the food supply in Asian and sub-Saharan countries. If women farmers in developing countries were given equal access to land, capital, technology, and education, increased in output would be 10 to 30%. So I think that one of the take-homes from this book was inclusion. And I thank you for it, but I did struggle with this chapter.
Allison, thank you. Okay, now over the Atlantic to CDL Oxford. Patrick, next.
Thank you and good morning, everybody. We're going to jump into chapter 5, the background of which is essentially that for all of human history, the food production capacity of economies increased roughly in line with population. So from 400 BCE to the early 19th century, population growth in consequence was pretty anemic. But then the steam engine showed up with its multiple horsepower. By the way, horsepower we still use for cars today. It's a bit weird, isn't it? So in summary, the chapter paints a picture of the launch of the industrial age and how, using one prominent example in the book, the story of George Stephenson, the role of the entrepreneur as the critical architect of that age, one that broke the old model of power belonging to these landowners and merchants to a new class of wealth creators. Stephenson, the key example, was the lead engineer in then what was a railway competition and established the first true productive railway in Britain, leading to one of the many key linchpins in the massive progress of the Industrial Revolution. Even though everyone understood that the Industrial Revolution was supported by the Enlightenment in sciences and material sciences, a key question remained. Why Britain, when so many other countries were also endowed with science, capital, talent? And then the author goes through the most possible leads, including geography, demography, Protestantism, natural resources, and looking for the answer for why Britain. In the end, the author locks on one key difference: a nation of entrepreneurs, lower and middle class folks trying out in business. To quote the author, nowhere else in the world at that time do we see so many middle class people trying to pierce through the existing social hierarchy. It was in the middling sort of men who were critical for the innovations and introduction of new technologies throughout much of the 18th and 19th century in Britain. That's the difference. Extremely ambitious, often coming from craft background with skills and flair for innovation. And as a fertile ground for all this societal change, he paints, the shackles of the old feudal system that had been loosened in Britain through ultimately the Glorious Revolution, paving the way to more recognition of individual rights. But interestingly, this new bourgeoisie did not jump, he points, on an egalitarian or more communitarian ballot. And more often than not, these new aspirants adopted the ways of the aristocracy and basically condescending on the rural and the poor, who were basically considered a meaner sort. Again, in the author's words, it was entirely natural for these aspirant class to focus on accumulating wealth without worrying about improving the standards of living. So to the question of why Britain, my criticism of this example is we can't simply underestimate the fertile ground under which Britain's economy was running at the time. Elements such as, I believe, a better picture of the times would have presented, and this is just for illustrative purposes, 4 critical necessary forces and a framework at work: better legal structures, the property rights, contract laws, LLCs, independent courts to support the legal structure, and a minimum scale of complementary technologies such as Bessemer steel and access to capital, and then also entrepreneurship. With his analysis of why Britain, it's easy to portray these elements as just pick and choose across the other societies, but I think that just life is more complicated than just one key linchpin, and could have been better illustrated. Thank you. I love the book.
Thank you, Patrick. The next chapter, we go to CDL Seattle and a number of other CDLs. Andrew.
I think it's maybe intentional that the Brits should discuss this chapter because it starts in the first half of the 19th century in the United Kingdom, describes how technology in Britain dramatically increased production. Cotton mills increased their productivity, for example, by 266 times over individual weavers. And the lives of workers became substantially worse. Much longer hours, less pay, crowded conditions, poor sanitation, no sewers, no running water, epidemics of infectious disease, 6-year-olds working 14 hours a day in mines, dreadful pollution from factories. Manchester is described as, quote, the gates of hell. Politicians are unrealistically optimistic that technology would improve the lives of the general populace. Reality was that technology was actually mainly benefiting powerful elites and a small new class of factory owners. Oh.
Try now.
Okay. Hello?
Still not very close.
Maybe if you just take the right off and hold the...
Okay. Is that better?
Oh, that's better.
All right. Politicians are unrealistically optimistic that technology would improve the lives of the general populace. Reality was that technology mainly benefited powerful elites and a new small class of factory owners who used technology to eliminate labor. Poor laws criminalized poverty, and that meant there was a lot of children in forced labor.
Andrew, sorry to pause you. Maybe just if you can just hold it down by your mouth. Yeah, try that.
Is that better?
Let's see, let's bring the mic back up.
Hello?
No, you have to keep
Okay.
holding.
All right. Second half of the 20th century describes how technology in Britain continued to be used to increase production, but it created new industries and new skilled jobs, and the lives of workers. Okay.
No, it should come on.
Is it on? Okay. The lives of workers in the second half of the century improved, and that's because wages grew faster than productivity. These changes are attributed to three things in the book. Americanism, that's using technology to enhance the productivity of workers and not replace them. That's Americanism. New networks that enabled new industries, railways, the telegraph, telephone, new power structures, including trade unions, and the expansion of political accountability. Poor laws are reformed, and attitudes to poverty considerably softened. They weren't that great, however. My grandmother was born in 1899. She lived as a shoeless waif in the Norwich poorhouse until she was 11 years old. Okay, objections, things that I find surprising. The title of the chapter is Casualties of Progress, and this anchors the reader in the idea that bad outcomes are the consequence of progress. And the title of this chapter should be Casualties of Coercive Power. The period that the book covers is initially dominated by innovations in artificial muscle, AM. This is massively disruptive to labor, which had little social, political, economic power, and that led to social strife, to Luddites, to Chartists, riots, gradual changes in power dynamics, with trade unions becoming legal in 1871 and the right to vote being substantially expanded. It's these changes in power dynamics that are important in shaping the second half of the 20th century. Innovation in the 20th century, I would say, was dominated by social and political transformation. The transition from autocracy to democracy in the West, rights for women and minorities expanding, the expansion of freedom caused by the collapse of the Soviet Union and the liberalization of China. Eventually, most people in the last century benefited, even our family in Estonia who escaped the yoke of Soviet repression in 1992. So, we now have a successor to artificial muscle, and it's called artificial intelligence. And this again creates massive potential shifts in power dynamics, socially, politically, economically, and militarily. For the future to be one that's positive for the general population, it's essential that policy focus on individual freedom, accountability for our politicians, and most importantly, our increasingly powerful regulatory state. So, I would posit to you that we should go to the hockey stick behind me. There are nearly 2 millennia where the total sum of economic output barely changes. Around 1850, it takes off. This is not technology. This is the power of social, economic, and political freedom. The hockey stick is the radical idea that the best way to collective prosperity is individual liberty, what the authors call Americanism. I'm a Brit, and I have an American passport for a good reason.
Just before we turn to Peter, I will just thank Andrew. We recently did a trip to CDL Estonia, and while we were there, we visited a museum called Vabamu. And Andrew's family were the benefactors of Vabamu, and it focused on, it's a museum of freedom. And you couldn't help but be standing in that museum talking about the innovations at CDL and recognizing that we're in a country that's on the border of Russia, and be very moved by your family's museum. And so the fact that you ended your remarks on freedom, I think are very fitting, Andrew. Okay, thank you for that. And we now go to CDL Wisconsin. Peter Settle.
Chapter 7, the contested path, and it continues the path towards, or seeking a path towards shared prosperity, reduction in inequality, increasing opportunity. It's building off a construct that was mentioned earlier from Chapter 1, which is, quote, "There is nothing automatic about new technologies bringing widespread prosperity. Whether they do or not is an economic, social, and political choice." And I think that's an important theme. The contested path covers the Second Industrial Revolution and the start of the 20th century and the impact of electrification and broad system reengineering, not dissimilar to the transformational technologies, digital technologies, and AI today. Goes through the Great Depression, World War II, and then running into post-World War II economic expansion and the automation prior to the Third Industrial Revolution and acceleration of digital technologies. I'm going to simplify the main point of Chapter 7 to be one of hope, which is we can do this and we have evidence. And I think that the author does an admirable job of pointing out that evidence primarily in the post-World War II economic expansion. And even if some of the evidence is short-lived or bursty or under circumstances that are unique and not easily replicable, there is important evidence, and I'll use a few quotes. After World War II, much of the Western world and some countries in Asia built new institutions supporting shared prosperity and enjoyed rapid growth that benefited almost all segments of societies. I think the critical terms throughout this chapter and in general are around systems-based approaches, looking at the broad system, and choices. There's a lot of material on this, but I think a couple of quotes on this concept of choices. New tasks during this era played a critical role both in driving productivity growth and in spreading the gains across the skill distribution. In industries with new tasks, we see higher productivity growth as well as higher demand for lower skilled workers, who thus also benefited from technological process. Choices about technology and rent sharing during these decades were defining the ways. And that idea of new tasks increasing demand for skilled labor, but pulling along the rest of the workforce is an important part of this post-World War II set of examples and evidence. There's the building blocks that are mentioned, I think, is where I start to get into the debate. First, the direction of travel of new technology that generated not just cost savings through automation, but also plenty of new tasks. Agreed. Secondly, an institutional structure that bolstered countervailing powers from workers and government regulation. Agreed, but it's in the how. There's a lot of discussion then, the how being around collective bargaining and the labor unions being the necessary ingredient for that. And I would just say that's debatable. And there isn't as convincing evidence there. And there's also evidence that you point out at the end of the chapter, which is even with some of the shared prosperity, it wasn't really equal. There was still significant disparity around women participating in the workforce, Black Americans participating, and immigrants. So I wouldn't put the necessary ingredient on the labor unions in that case. And I would also just say, I think that it doesn't jive with the example of Ford and Henry Ford. And I think that in, Jay, your book, you also use, and Avi and Josh, you use Ford as an example. And I think the comparison of how we're looking at Ford being the system innovator, the system entrepreneur is the way you describe it, I think is the important piece here that may be missing from this chapter and how you're looking at Ford as the example. And I think that spirit of entrepreneurship, that spirit of innovation, that desire to create new demand is the piece that I think is a little bit inconsistent in the way we're looking at the examples of the post-World War II economic expansion. So I would say trying to find that path back to entrepreneurship and system thinking and choices is I think, very, very important. But I think putting too much emphasis on one piece of that is where I would say it's a little bit debatable.
Okay, Peter, thank you very much. Daron, how are you holding up?
Wonderful. This is great. Thank you. These are excellent readings and wonderful summaries and points. Let me just say a few things about each one of the chapters. Allison, you're right. I think chapter 4 is disturbing. I knew much of the history when I wrote it, but I was disturbed when I wrote it. We stop before the mechanization of agriculture. We discussed some of that in chapter 7 that Peter mentioned. And things have worked out better, and I'll come back to that in the context of my comments to Peter. But I think very much like what Andrew and Peter also emphasized and what you emphasized, I think when power was so unequally distributed, ex post, perhaps it's not so surprising that things haven't worked out so well. The extent to which all of that surplus was captured by a very small elite even is surprising to me. And Patrick, you're absolutely right. It's, we don't know why Britain, and I think the institutional features, that's what I emphasized in my past work, but these institutional features were not unique to Britain, so it's a combination of things. But this vision is very important, and your summary is completely right. I think that vision was uplifting. Nowhere around the world you had a vision of piercing hierarchy as you did in the United Kingdom. But it's also funny how while they were being revolutionaries, they were so condescending to the lower classes and wanted to exclude them and were extremely harsh on them. I mean, the poor laws, as Andrew mentioned, actually got worse, more draconian under the new democracy of Britain. And then, Andrew, you're absolutely right. You put a slightly different interpretation of individual freedom that's completely consistent with what we are saying. I mean, but it's not like a libertarian freedom. That's what we try to emphasize. The transformation that the United Kingdom underwent in the 19th century is really mind-boggling. From a society that was non-democratic, only less than 2% of adults could vote at the beginning of the century, to from a society in which trade union activity was completely illegal and was persecuted using a number of different laws. You had no public infrastructure, the welfare of the lower classes didn't matter. You had Masters and Servant Acts, which made it illegal for workers to actually change employers. You had a complete transformation of institutions. But also important in that is that the direction of technological change altered in this process. And I think that's what we sort of try to put an emphasis on. And the reason, just like chapter 4, the beginning of that chapter may sound a little, depressing. Children as young as 5 or 6 working in coal mines 18 hours a day, pushing carts with their heads, working hours increasing by 25% that already were very long. Life expectancy falling to perhaps 30 years at birth. But the reason why we go that, because exactly like Andrew said, in the second half of the chapter, we emphasize what happens in the second half of the 19th century when all of these things change. So that really shows the element of choice that, when you organize technology differently, when you organize society differently, things can change a lot. And as Peter pointed out, that is the background to the better outcomes. So it's really we had to cut it somewhere, but you could have taken that part from chapter 6 and put it with chapter 7 because it's really a continuation. And I think Peter's summary was excellent. It's all great. One thing he did not mention, and no reason for you to mention, except that it sort of is related to Allison's question, so let me mention that for 30 seconds. So we discussed, for example, what happened when the US mechanized agriculture and productivity shot up. And why did it do so? Well, first of all, that was ripe for mechanization. Really very inefficient use of hand methods, and in some of the crops, the improvements were of the order of 20-fold. But at the same time, all of the workers that were freed from agriculture started moving into other sectors. So this creating of new tasks in industry, like in the Ford Motor factories, white-collar tasks that started exploding, jobs for women, jobs for workers with high school education, they really exploded. So it was this two engines that were important, not just mechanization of agriculture. So if it was just mechanization of agriculture and we didn't do the creation of new tasks in other sectors, it would not have generated the prosperity, and it certainly would not have generated the shared prosperity. And I will conclude early by reiterating a point that Peter made, and perhaps we should have been even more explicit on this. The 30 years that followed World War II were really phenomenal. Very rapid growth, labor productivity improvements, much greater mobility of workers out of the sectors in which they were, and inequality actually declined during that period. So really shared prosperity, wages at the bottom are increasing. And that's the hopeful message. It can be done. The one question that we don't know the answer, and Peter hinted at, and I think you should decide yourself, was that a really special period that we cannot replicate? We don't think so. I think there are ways of learning from that episode, and I'll agree with Peter. Labor management relations were very important, and they weren't always the best. There were some periods in which that was cooperative while labor voice was heard, and those were the periods when unions emphasized training and creating new tasks for workers. I think that's a message that we could have amplified even more, that in the future, it's not the conflictual labor relations that we need. It's the one that is somewhat more cooperative, where you can have the worker voice on how better you can incorporate digital technologies and AI into the production processes, but while not blocking technological change. And that may be a very difficult thing to achieve. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, now we shift over to CDL Atlanta, CDL Paris, and CDL Toronto, the Space Stream, and the CEO of X Prize, Anusha.
Thank you. So in chapter 8, along the same line, how digitization and use of computer software and automation has increased inequality and loss of opportunities for labor. It cites recent research that suggests automation actually accounts for 3/4 of overall increase in inequality and at different levels of demographic in the United States. And how large corporations jumping on the automation bandwagon and eliminating labor has contributed to this inequality. But they did this to increase productivity and profitability. But if we look at the data, it shows that productivity actually has been stagnant and not matched by the investment in automation. It also looks at the swing of opinions from the market skeptical perspectives to market-friendly ones, and uses Ralph Nader's book Unsafe at Any Speed as an example of how it became the manifesto of keeping corporations accountable and protecting the consumer. And that led to the first safety standards for automotives and breaking up of AT&T monopolies in the telecom industry, as well as important institutions and agencies like EPA, FDA, and OSHA during the same time. In the 80s, the pendulum started swinging the other direction with formation of the Business Roundtable funded by large corporations and influencing politics. And the philosophy of Friedman Doctrine and Jensen Amendment became dominant, promoting shareholder value revolution, where corporations and managers were encouraged to maximize market through short-term profits. The assumption was that unregulated market combined with growth in productivity will automatically benefit everyone. But in reality, what happened was what we see in recent years, where large income and opportunity gaps were created, and large monopolies were created that controlled the direction of everything, was maximizing profits. What I found surprising or disturbing a little bit is the fact that technology was cited as the reason for all this. And as someone who's the CEO of an organization with a mission to advance technology breakthroughs to solve humanity's greatest challenges toward building an equitable world of abundance, I believe innovation used intelligently can make the world better. The reason we don't see this manifested in the world today is our antiquated value system, a system that is byproduct of the Friedman Doctrine and short-term profit above all. I believe that technology, automation, AI only exposes the weaknesses in our governing and value system, but doesn't create it. In fact, today technology has done more good in the world than harm. I do agree that we're in a very critical point and we need to be careful, because we have now created very large, powerful companies, a few of them, and with 1% of the wealth of the world trapped, with most of the wealth of the world trapped in the hands of 1% of the population. And technology, at the same time, though, has lifted billions out of poverty and created a level of transparency because of the way we're connected and can communicate together, that we can now use this power to reverse the tides and use this transparency to take back the power that people have lost. We need to consider a society where people's well-being is not measured by how many hours they work, but how they can live dignified lives, and measure it by a happiness index. Technology is not preordained, it doesn't have a preordained direction, and nothing about it is inevitable. Technology has increased inequality largely because the choices that companies and other powerful and actors have made in society.
Anushe, thank you. Okay, next up is Sten from CDL Estonia. Just Sten, before you begin your remarks, he was one of the team that developed and grew Skype. But we began talking about launching CDL Estonia in the fall of 2020. And then there's a bunch of bureaucratic process we need to go through both universities, University of Toronto, University of Tartu, where CDL Estonia is based. And so in the early parts of 2022, the pens were coming out to sign the launch of CDL Estonia. And what was interesting to us about Estonia from a technology, we're the most advanced government in the world with respect to digitization. Totally digitized government. Everything online, and has been for over a decade. You can get your birth certificate, pay your parking tickets, get your health records, everything online. So much for all the other countries to learn from, Estonia. And so the ink was starting to just be placed on the paper in February of 2022. And then, of course, Russia rolled into Ukraine. And we called the CDL Estonia team and we asked them, do you still want to proceed? Because we understand that the world has changed for you overnight. And we understand if you would like to put these plans on, your priorities as a nation have changed. And their response impacted the entire. They said, we now prioritize this more than ever. And Stan, if you could share with us why you had that response, and then we'll go to your comments in the chapter.
Thank you. Talk about cold calling, Professor. Thank you so much for this context. And I think building on top of what Andy was already saying, when a country like Estonia was occupied by the Soviet Union in a repressive regime for 50 years, it's easy to talk about the atrocities of the occupation and things that our friends in Ukraine are seeing today. That doesn't matter. What matters is the freedom that you have, and the occupation is the lack of freedom. So when you start unpacking the freedoms, the freedom of speech, the freedom of innovation, the freedom of entrepreneurship, all of that, and the fact that the only way a tiny country can survive is to be as networked as possible with like-minded people around the world, that makes it a no-brainer. Like a network like CDL, the fantastic entrepreneurial ecosystem that Estonia already has, created with our 10 unicorns and hundreds of 1,000+ teams building, like that's what glues Estonia into the global texture and innovation, and I think that's what we want to be.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Chapter 9, basically the premise is the mainstream tech optimist view of automation. If you take a mundane burden off humans, then we do have the ingenuity of doing something better and smarter, like we always have. So that's what a mainstream technologist would believe. And chapter 9 goes against that, or starts contrasting to that view of this sort of inherently good machine intelligence, and proposes that there is something more useful, which is called machine usefulness. And that framework includes, or the chapter describes, things like using AI to generate tasks for humans, or providing tools for creativity, and bringing people together, and providing communication tools, and giving people or workers flexibility and freedom to choose, even in heavily automated industries. That basically making the technology used for people. And as a builder and as an entrepreneur, like I love a good prioritization framework. Like if you have this sort of two choices of using AI to replace a human completely, or just augment the humans and the system to do more in their job, like that's a great framework, right? But something sort of started nagging me, and then I think it's like kind of one edge of that is like we're building AI as a lapdog, and I'm not sure. So chapter 9 examples that made me doubt about that were, for example, there was an example of using machine vision to OCR paper-based checks. Like I look at that as a technologist, it's inherently wrong use of AI. Like the point should be to get money digital rather than automate paper-based check processing to help humans. Or there's another example or several examples of AI imitating humans and helping them in tasks that humans do. The issue with that is that I think it misses a very crucial opportunity of technology, which is it sort of locks AI-enabled systems into the limitations of humans. You miss things like processing speed and parallelism, and something that the technology can be better at than humans if you only start sort of waiting behind a human. And then there were examples around, for example, Amazon tracking their employees and that being inherently inhuman, which I could also argue that actually following on a commercial agreement between parties of what they do and tracking that is not maybe not inherently bad. So two critiques or two challenges to the authors coming out of this. I think my first question that I kept having while reading was that are we so sure that people in the long tail of low-skilled jobs actually want lapdogs that support them doing more of those low-skilled jobs? Like that for me feels that like when I was flying here, I went to the airport, I picked up a bottle of water, paid with my watch, scanned the bottle and walked away. There was no human present. And like if I think that there would have been a human to take that bottle of water and scanning the code, like I don't think that human is actually living a fulfilling and sort of intellectually stimulating life. And this is something where we, by replacing that person and releasing them to do something more useful is great. And I think our moral objective should be rather to give people more education, more opportunities for personal growth, more access to advanced machine intelligence, and those things kind of seem the opposite of less AI and more freedom maybe. And my second critique is that I think this chapter is mostly suffering from an attempt to define AI as one thing. And in anything we talk about regulation and rights protection and creating a level playing field, I think it's a way more layered issue. Like if you talk about nuclear energy, the way you handle electricity, building a nuclear power plant, and maybe the Hadron Collider are quite different concepts, and I think we do ourselves a disservice by trying to mash them all together too closely. Thank you.
Sten, thank you. Okay, we turn next to CDL Toronto and soon CDL Montreal, because they're working together in the area of blockchain, and an author of one of the seminal blockchain papers, Scott Sternetta.
You remember blockchain. It was last year's. Sorry. I note just in passing that my dissertation was in AI, and so I know a little bit about that. This is a good book, and we should all read it. Chapter 10, Democracy Breaks, is about what you'd expect, namely a depressingly familiar litany of apparent issues with technology that have increased the strength of authoritarian regimes and challenged the foundation of what's necessary for a democratic culture to work. And it's concerning, it's heavy. We should all read it. Let me summarize from his own words a couple of parts in more detail. The main thesis is this, and I quote, "The pernicious effects of digital technologies and AI on politics and social discourse were not inevitable, resulted from the specific way in which these technologies were developed." He elaborates this notion of, Theron elaborates this notion of choices that tech firms made early on, and then these enormously powerful positive feedback loops, both from authoritarian regimes as well as companies seeking to make the ad-based internet bargain, what some have called the Faustian bargain, to work. Something I find myself in violent agreement with him about. So now I'm supposed to, mark these words, talk about the single point I found most objectionable, surprising, or controversial. Didn't you read the chapter about what is worsening our social discourse? So I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to quibble over the 10% of things that we might disagree on, which I could mention if I were a flagrant self-promoter, such as civility.chat being the solution to the social discourse problem, and a forthcoming paper with Josh Gans, that's G-A-N-S, on the inverse advertising model. No, I'm not going to quibble about things like that. And I'm not going to take the bait to find something objectionable, controversial, or surprising. Instead, I'm going to come back to what I consider the single most important observation that can be drawn from a study that he cites, a Facebook study, where there was a control group that continued obsessively using Facebook, and then a group that was incentivized to get off of Facebook for a little while. Those that stopped using Facebook spent more time doing other social activities and were significantly happier. Why shouldn't I stop there? Because when the study was over, they went back to Facebook. Okay? I really think this is a pogo moment. You know, we have met the enemy, and he is us. We don't need to go looking halfway across the world to authoritarian regimes to get at the essence of what's causing this disruption. It's right in our basal ganglia, and good luck overcoming it.
You always come to CDL to be uplifted. All right, the last chapter. Siobhan, before you begin your chapter remarks, up until very recently, you served on the board of OpenAI that created ChatGPT. Did you have any idea that when this would drop on November 30 of 2022, that it would resonate around the globe the way that it has?
The timing was surprising because there was a much more capable model that had already been trained that folks had internal access to. I think the reason the ChatGPT thing transformed the world is it was the first time that pretty much everyone in the world with access to a computer could meaningfully interact with the power of the model without having any form of expert knowledge. So some folks had seen it before just in interacting with things like Copilot, but you had to be a coder to really see the magic. And again, this made it just very broad and very human in a way that I think was exceptionally unnerving for people. And when I talk about AI, I really do talk about it in pre and post ChatGPT era language. And so I do think it is that important of a moment.
Yes, thank you. So the final chapter, Siobhan, is yours.
I just want to make one note since you pointed out Professor Gans. Josh, if you can just do Gans with Gans as a podcast, I would be elated. So please do. So anyway, to bring us home, this chapter is called Redirecting Technology. The author highlights the Gilded Age of the late 19th century, which is an era with a sort of broad technical breakout and the creation of large corporations, most notably Rockefeller Standard Oil. The good news of that period is overall real wages did go up, but the bad news is there was exceptionally harmful monopolistic behaviors that obviously were not a great thing. The author highlights that there was essentially a bottoms-up progressive movement that fought back and exposed bad behaviors. And this was partially driven by investigatory journalists, which I'm curious to hear your take on, but they sound like they were way more noble back in those days, so I'm curious as to why. In any event, they were able to change prevailing narratives and successfully advocated for changes in areas like antitrust law and the curtailing of corporate contributions to politicians, among many other things. The author argues that much of the same progressive playbook helped the climate change movement succeed, and that we should remember that playbook as we seek to shepherd digital technologies into our future in the best way possible. He categorizes that three-step playbook as changing the prevailing narrative, creating countervailing forces, and enacting targeted policy change. He notes that regulatory measures should likely include both carrots, like investment and subsidies in the right direction, and sticks, like taxation of technologies that move in the wrong direction. The author believes that the digital era presents its own set of unique risks. The author focuses on automation, surveillance, data collection, and advertising as primary issues to target. He argues that society needs to change the power and default desires of corporates and ensure technology is moving in a way that actually benefits humans. The author suggests several potential tactics for redirecting technologies, such as automation taxes, breaking up big technology, tax reform, investing in workers, government leadership in the right direction, and privacy protection and data ownership. The author does also look at UBI as a potential solution, but for some of the reasons Albert mentioned, he's not an overall fan of it. The author reminds us by reminding the reader that the future of technology remains unwritten, and so it can be influenced, which is a lovely note of hope to end on, and so I do appreciate that. In terms of responses, if I do have time, I'll share the two things that I think created the greatest emotional responses in me. One of them was kind of just a pitting of humans versus machines in a way where we might be discriminating against humans systematically, which I found interesting. And so you highlighted in particular the fact that the existence of a payroll tax may just be across the board incentivizing use of machine labor as opposed to human labor. If that's the case, and our tax code is not modernizing to suit, obviously, we should reform to suit. But I think the one thing I wanted to, highlight is I would be extremely wary of doing that in specific subdomains, preferentially. An obvious example would be NASA in a pre-computer era used human brains to compute complex mathematics. Given the expanding complexity and the errors that humans make in math, I think that would be considered reckless endangerment now. I think we're about to embark on the same type of transition as it relates to something like driving. So 20 years from now, I do think it will be considered reckless endangerment for a human to drive. And so I think we should be very careful not to artificially keep humans in roles where there is kind of obsolescence. The second and last piece was you did speak about China and kind of the importance, especially on if something will require global coordination, it is important that China will follow suit. You make the argument that in the case of climate change, China did essentially follow suit with kind of the Western step. And you mentioned that you think the same will be true here in the era of AI. I'm very cautious about taking that perspective here for a couple of reasons. One, I think that we should not rest on our laurels of kind of being global trendsetters as it relates, especially as it relates to China, because they're catching up exceptionally quickly and have eclipsed in certain domains. And for anyone who knows me, the thing I think about most is AGI, and I do think it is likely that we have a coordination problem that is more intricate than any we've ever encountered before. And so I do think we should just invest a lot of time and energy in ensuring that we have the right collaboration mechanisms with an entity like China. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Another set of 4 excellent comments, and I'm really grateful for the careful reading and constructive thoughts. Anusha's discussion was perfect. I think you summed up everything, and you put the emphasis on exactly the right thing, using digital technologies intelligently. And I think I would just add that's about understanding and making sure that we put them to the right use, but also like whose interests. Sometimes there will be a conflict of interest between a manager who wants to just cut costs, but it may not be good. So that's where regulation comes in. And I think you slightly touched on that, but that's really central to the story of Chapter 8. And Stan, thank you very much. Those are excellent comments. First of all, absolutely, AI is many things. At some point in the book, we had a paragraph citing from Stuart Russell and Peter Norvik's textbook where they start with 12 definitions of AI, and then the publisher said, this is too academic, don't do that. But yeah, obviously, so there's going to be some simplification. So I completely agree with you. There are tasks which should be done by machines. That's the perspective. And coming back to Siobhan's discussion as well, that's why we're not in favor of automation taxes. We want automation to go on, but at the same time, other things as well. That's why leveling the playing field is so important, so that other things are encouraged as well. But you don't want to slow down automation. Now, the question is, which is more in the nitty-gritty, and on some of that, I'm sure we may disagree, and you probably have more on-the-ground knowledge, so I'll respect that very much. What are the things that should be left to machines versus not? So I think that's a case-by-case decision. Entrepreneurs will decide that. Some regulation will decide that. But I think, as you pointed out, our general purpose in that chapter is to make one overarching point, which is we should not be mesmerized by machine intelligence. It's great. They have capabilities. But what we want from machines is usefulness to us. We have the privileged position of being humans, which has a lot of control over the environment, and we have the privileged position of designing the machines of the next century. So we should try to make them as useful to us as possible, whether they are autonomous, intelligent. I think that's secondary. Often it gets in the way. I know sometimes in the industry, intelligence is so exciting, and I can sympathize with that, but that's why we want to sort of put that usefulness agenda. Monitoring, I think, a certain degree of monitoring and coordination is definitely the prerogative of employers and should be done. But if you do it excessively, it really goes against this machine usefulness, because you're not making machines useful to a broad set of people. You're just making it useful to one person who wants to sort of extract more surplus out of that. So that's why we give examples like clopening, where you get the same employer at the last moment to say you close at 9 p.m. and open at 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. The productivity gains you're going to get from that are minimal, but if you have the technology to impose that on people, they will obey it, but it's not. So that's the sort of the frame that we want for the monitoring. Scott, thank you very much. Those were excellent comments, and I have nothing to add. I think you got it right. But one thing which we don't say in the book, but let me add it here. I think the big question in the background here is the following. As humans, we are social animals. Our intelligence is social. Every bit of our utility and welfare in this planet is social. And everything we do has adapted to that sociality. And that sociality is based on real social networks, interactions, etc. Now onto that, you put a completely new ways for humans to interact. It's bound to create problems. The question is, how can we navigate that? And I think the problem is a particular business model that navigates that by drawing you more and more into these artificial worlds, more and more control of information, is likely not to be healthy. And I think that's what you emphasize as well. And that's the context in which I discuss a lot of China in that context, because, you know, the social media in the US and China look very different, but they have some parallels, and that's the problem. And finally, onto the policy or redirecting technological change. In the book, we call it changing the narratives, and I think that's one way of talking about it. More recently, I've used a slightly different word, let me share that. Agreeing on the aspirations. I think, again, we don't pretend that we have the answers. This is part of a conversation. But the big point that we're trying to make is there is an aspiration out there that we could all have. And if we have that aspiration, that's 50% of the work done. And I would call that a pro-human AI, which is we aspire to make AI as usable, as empowering, and as beneficial to a large number of people. And that requires not just regulation, it requires really redirection of technological change. And that's what frames everything else in that chapter. And payroll taxes, I think that's one important thing, because I think the economists think very differently about capital taxes. I've moved away from that. I think if you give businesses a tax system that says, you can install machinery and you get subsidized, you can hire workers, you get taxed, that is a problem. But more broadly, all of these ideas are in the spirit of let's get the conversation started. We are, as sure as I can be that there is a possibility for redirecting technological change and a better sort of aspirations we can have. I don't have certainty on any of the policies, but they're all trying to deal with some problems. Like, for example, we discussed digital ad taxes. Why? Because digital ad taxes are part of an effort to broaden the set of business models that can be. Like, today, it's very difficult to have a subscription-based business model or recreate something like Wikipedia, because free service financed by digital ad taxes is so profitable. So it creates a sort of a tilted playing field. So you want to encourage other business models. And the reason why we don't say we don't want automation taxes, not yet anyway, unless things become really bad. What we want is things like X prizes or government prizes or other things, encourage new ways of using AI in a more pro-human way. Again, what are those ones? We can again talk about it and we can disagree. Is it, nursing? Is it educators? Is it creative works? Is it office work? Is it actually blue-collar work where you can use AI, augmented reality, VR? I think those are all valid questions that a lot more thought should be spent on. But anyway, this was a really uplifting and wonderful conversation. Thanks to IJA for organizing it, and thanks to these 11 wonderful people for their amazing comments, and I look forward to the questions from the audience.
Doron, you just, in your final concluding comments, you referenced X Prize, and you said, this is one example of a way to change direction. I think the largest X Prize was donated by an entrepreneur capitalist, Elon Musk, $100 million for carbon capture. In other words, it wasn't from the government. It was from the private sector. Would you advocate for the U.S. government to write Anousheh a series of $100 million checks in order to shift the direction? Because what you described, what Scott described, was we're unable to, the market's not setting the right directions in terms of incentivizing innovation in the direction, your book is largely saying markets aren't working. If I were to retitle your book, I would title it Markets Aren't Working in the Case of AI. And so Anousheh's got an organization whose job is to address market failures. So would one of your policy prescriptions be to Washington, please write a series of $100 million checks, be as smart as Elon Musk, and give her and institutions like hers, not just hers, but the capacity to counteract the very strong incentives that markets have been creating that lead all of us working on entrepreneurial activities in order to point things in a direction that will lead to good outcomes for society.
Well, after you've subjected me to this, now you put me on the spot again, AJ. Thank you. Look, I think XPRIZE is fantastic, and Anusha deserves a lot of credit, but no, I wouldn't ask the US government to write $100 million checks because we don't want a single vision. XPRIZE is going to have its own vision of what's useful technology, but we want other sort of perspectives as well, and actually the government should not be the innovator, but should be a partner itself in setting some of the agendas, as it used to do, in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and many of the technologies that we have come to depend on today were not created by the government, but they were created with partnership with the government. Computers, the internet, nanotechnology, sensors, antibiotics. So I think there is room for the government to stand alongside XPRIZE and have their own views. Perhaps they think that it's solar panels or something else, not carbon capture, that we should be. Yes, we mentioned, for example, the redirection of technological change in the energy space as a partial success. But what are the specific levers we should push? I don't know. Carbon capture may be very promising. Geoengineering may be, or perhaps it may be a bad idea. So we have to really try all of these things. So that's why you need a diversity of incentives out there as well.
Okay, thank you. Can we have a mic, please, up here at the front? I'm going to call on a few people, and then we'll have a time for a few questions, very short questions. But Professor Sutton, I'm going to start with you. Very few people spend their life's work to build a field that is, for most of Professor Sutton's career, fully obscure. Unless you were in a very way out in the lunatic fringe of computer science, you would have never heard of Professor Sutton. And then all of a sudden, his life's work sprang onto the world stage. And it is probably, in the area of machine learning now, the single most important topic area. So when you see that your life's work has led to conversations like this, and I'm not asking you really to opine on the politics or policies, but if you could just share with us, you're going to be speaking tomorrow on your area of expertise. So what's your reflection when you hear so many people debating on what society should do and in reaction to something that you and your graduate students and your colleagues have unleashed?
Whew. Boy. Well, of course, there's a part that says this was all the plan. The plan was that AI, intelligence, understanding, thinking would become very important, and eventually it would be realized, and maybe that's happening now, or maybe something else is happening now. I'm not sure. And I have worked all my life on this, but now we're talking about power and progress, and this is, so I'm going to step outside my life's work and be bold or foolish and talk about what's going on. And so I have a question for Darren. If this is about democratic control of technology being a good idea, that's what I think you said, almost those very words. And I'm concerned about that because democratic control also means government control. And as you know, our governments that we like to style as democratic also have authoritarian tendencies. And so I'm worried that by calling for democratic control, you're calling for authoritarian control.
Absolutely. I think there are two objections you can make about democratic control, and both of them are valid. One is that whoever is outside of the field is not going to have the expertise, and there is a possibility of mistaken views. And the second is exactly that the government control may come with democratic control and may turn authoritarian. I think both of those are valid concerns, and we have to struggle to contain them. So trying to do the democratic exchange of opinion based on better knowledge, first inform the public. That's the role of academics who are in the field, who are outside of the field, of the journalists. I think that's one important part. And also make sure that the input is for the relevant thing. So the example I give, you never want input from the public about how to design nuclear reactors, but you do want input whether they want nuclear weapons or nuclear energy. So that's the level of doing that. And when it comes to the government, yes, you're absolutely right. My previous book with James Robinson was The Narrow Corridor. It was all about the balance between state and society, and it's an ongoing balance. When technology changes, that balance will have to change, and there is no guarantee that democracy will survive after such shocks. But I tend to think that more decentralized control of information as opposed to centralized control of information is also good for democracy, and I think the right sort of regulatory framework is necessary for that because of the forces that exist with the economies of scale, network effects, Moore's law, all of that create some tendencies, not unstoppable, but tendencies for a lot of data and a lot of compute power, a lot of economic resources to centralize in the hands of a few companies. That's not going to be conducive for decentralized information. So the right sort of regulatory approach, but also in a way that's dynamically adaptive so that it changes as the surface changes, I think that's going to be necessary.
Thank you. Let's, if we can pass the mic down this way, please. In Canada, for those visiting outside of Canada, in Canada, obviously our head of state is the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, and the Deputy Minister is Chrystia Freeland, and she's also our Finance Minister. And her Chief of Staff is here. So Leslie, I'm sorry I'm putting you on the spot. I'm just going to ask you, in terms of what you've heard, what do you think are the one or two most important messages that you'll take back to Ottawa with regards to thinking about machine intelligence and policy?
Well, thank you. Thank you for putting me on the spot. It's been a pleasure to be here this morning and to take in this conversation. I was actually just writing on a napkin here, sitting next to the incomparable Commander Hadfield, that the absence of government is also leading to an increase in authoritarianism. And that worries me because I feel very much the tension between government engagement in this space and also the need to find a way to speak for society and to ensure that governments are equipped for the transition that is likely ahead when it comes to just the change that is afoot, the change in our workplaces, the transition that workers are going to be going through, the need for new types of training, the need for collective engagement with industry. And I think I struggle with what the panel has brought up, which is how to generate that collective engagement to really have a productive discussion around this and to have a meaningful engagement of government in a way that actually supports the creative excitement of AI while ensuring that we're also developing the ethics, the norms, the standards, the framework, the supports that are needed to ensure that this truly is a force for good and a productive one, and one that contributes to a better society.
Leslie, thank you. Since a fair amount of the discussion was on power, Patrick, you were CFO of probably the most powerful company in the world with respect to AI at Google. Can you offer your reflections now that you've been out of Google for a little while and you've seen just all the machinations in the last 6 months in reaction to people realizing how powerful these models can be? I suspect you've had your own reflections. Anything that you'd like to comment on or share?
I was lucky that through my years at Google, we had a number of instances where, whether it be, just think of face recognition, but also AI, that on a regular basis would show up at our doorstep, an issue that required just real ethical thinking. You know, if I can recognize you everywhere, you know, it has implications. And it's the same thing for AI. I think that in general, I was lucky because I think Google has a high ethical bar, and many times we would say, well, hold on, let's make sure that we think about this right. I remember when we bought DeepMind with Demis as his leader, there was an actual full conversation at the time of the purchase of DeepMind about what is the ethical cadre in which we would operate DeepMind. And I think that, so, I think it can be done in the private sector. I think having a good watchdog in the public sector is not a bad idea either. So I think that, you know, coming back to this issue of democracy, there's nothing like good checks and balances and transparency, debate, and good checks and balances. And I think that at Google, we had a pretty good balance of it. I think that, you know, it's kind of like almost known that many of these models, I mean, Google worked on them, developed them, and because in some cases decided not to put them out there, created a lot of frustration in the Google community to kind of create all these outskirts of which, you know, augmented AI is kind of part of the story. And to me, I think that it's interesting that I'm delighted to see it's out there, right? It's like nuclear power, it's out there. So now what do you do with it? At the same time, it kind of reinforces the need to have the conversation about where do you put these guardrails, where are the checks and balances.
Thank you, Patrick. If we can have the mic over here, right over here to Haig Ferris. Haig is a pioneer of the venture capital industry in Canada. He's started Ventures West in the early 70s, and he's been wandering into university labs, meeting graduate students right down at the very sort of early kernels of ideas for almost half a century. And so, Haig, when you hear all this discussion, and Patrick, when he was discussing his chapter, kept referring to the role of entrepreneurs. Any reactions to what you've heard today with regards to your role of financing these ideas when they're at their very earliest forms?
Well, when I listen to that question, I feel like Cecil Green. I feel a long speech coming on.
Great, but you have about 90 seconds.
So, there's a couple of things. I think the world is full of good and evil, and it's never to be changed. And so, anything we can do to make sure that we have the guardrails and those things are very positive, but we can't lose sight that there are all kinds of companies and people around the world that don't give a damn about that. And so we have to guard very carefully on and have the knowledge of what others are doing, or we'll be in big trouble. I'm also a believer that, you know, the world has gone through all kinds of changes over the world where the end is nigh with the Industrial Revolution. And yet, every decade, every generation, things slowly seem to improve. And we wouldn't be sitting here but for all the innovation of things that have happened. I also think there are a lot of innovations that go unnoticed. And they're caused by the wars. For exploration. Seismic was what made the difference in finding the energy that we've used for the last few decades. How did it develop? It developed because physicists in the First World War began to measure the wavelengths from the Big Bertha that the Germans fired so they could get the information that the shells were coming before they came. And Cecil Green and others picked that up and made seismic a major tool. So there's all kinds of technologies like that, that also Texas Instruments was formed at the beginning of the Second World War, when the U.S. military said, we'll draft your scientists, or you can start developing commercial products for the U.S. military. So they formed Texas Instrument from their seismic company, and their first product was a magnetometer that they stuck in an airplane, and it was a subdetector. And then following the war, when Bell Labs invented the transistor in germanium, which looked like a German hand grenade, Texas Instruments came up with the idea of making it in silicon and changed the world, and it's almost going unnoticed. And Intel could never have done what they did without those kinds of transistors. So I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done, understanding it seemed like small innovations that never gained the public attention that ChatGPT has.
Hey, thank you.
And I think this session is incredible, and I thank you for it.
Thank you, Hey. Let me, if we can move the mic over to this side, please, to Suzanne Gildert. Suzanne, you've spent the last decade building the things that everybody on this stage is talking about. So building machine intelligence, and you're going to talk tomorrow about the embodied version of that intelligence. As you listen to people talking about the social and economic implications of the things that you're spending your life's work building, any reactions?
Well, I think it's obviously really important. I think that often technology people are asked to comment on a lot of the social and economic implications of it. And, you know, we're trained in technology and science and engineering, and it's a little bit outside of our wheelhouse. And I think that that's a bit unfortunate, because what it means is you could have people coming in from social studies and economics and politics and all these other disciplines and helping and forming coalitions to kind of like work with technologists, rather than just sort of saying to technologists, like, you have to think about all this and you have to solve those problems as well. So I'm really for owning, like, being the technology nerd in the room and having an opinion on the technology and knowledge about that, but also being open to conversations and discussions with people who are experts in all those other disciplines. So I just think disciplines need to really come together. It's not just about technology and engineering, it's about everything. So let's work together, and let's not put all the hard questions on the poor technologists.
Okay, Daron, you get the last 60 seconds, and then Sonia's going to send us into our break. Anything that you'd like to conclude with?
No, I just want to thank everybody for engaging with this. You know, the sole purpose of writing this book, you know, in addition to doing the academic research, which I enjoy very much, is to generate a conversation on these issues. And I think nobody has the answers to the questions. We don't pretend to, but I think we are fairly convinced that these are some of the questions that should be asked. And thanks for becoming so engaged with it. It's been wonderful.
Wonderful. And we, because of how many startups we have around the world at all the CDLs that are working on the commercialization of AI, we took your book very seriously. And we wanted to catalyze this conversation here on the stage, but then this will, of course, ripple on through the weeks and months to come as people are building these things and thinking about what you've given us here. So thank you very much. And Sonia, over to you.